Willow Creek, Texas, wasn't the kind of place that changed much. The streets were lined with old brick buildings that had stood for decades, the same neon open signs buzzing in the shop windows, the same dusty pickup trucks parked outside the general store. The people were friendly in that small town, always ready with a polite smile and a howdy, but they noticed everything. News traveled faster than the wind, and whispers had a way of sticking around for years. Everyone in town knew Samantha Miller. Folks just called her Sam, though not in the same affectionate way they used for other locals. Sam was a broken bar different. She stood a towering 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and strong, capable hands calloused from years of ranch work. She had been born and raised on the Miller family ranch, riding horses before she could even walk. By the age of 16, she could outrope, outlift, and outride most of the men in Willow Creek, and that reputation had never faded. Her height and strength, however, came with a price. Sam could feel eyes on her whenever she walked into town, whether it was at the feed store, the diner, or Sunday service at the small white chapel. Women whispered about how she scared the men off without even trying, while the men, well, most of them looked away, afraid to meet her gaze for too long. At Friday night dances in the barn, she'd sit on the sidelines nursing a glass of lemonade, watching other women being twirled under the strings of fairy lights while her own dance cards stayed empty. It wasn't that Sam didn't have admirers. From a distance, people respected her skill. She could break in a wild stallion in less than an afternoon, mend fences without help, and haul bales of hay as though they weighed nothing at all. She had taken over the family ranch after her parents passed, running it single-handedly with quiet determination. But in a place like Willow Creek, where tradition ran deep, men wanted a woman they could protect as someone they could feel taller and stronger than. Sam's very presence challenged that unspoken rule, and most men just didn't know how to handle it. Inside, though, Sam wasn't the unshakable figure people imagined. Behind her calm, stoic demeanor was a heart that longed for connection. At night, after the day's work was done, she would sit on the creaky porch swing her father had built, looking out over the open fields. The Texas stars stretched endlessly above her, a breathtaking canvas that made the world feel both vast and lonely. She would see couples strolling past on the dirt road holding hands, leaning close, laughing, and a small ache would bloom in her chest. She wasn't jealous, she was simply aware of how far away that life seemed from hers. Sam had tried dating once or twice, but it never went anywhere. One man had told her half joking, half serious that he didn't want to feel like the smaller half of the couple. Another simply stopped calling after their first lunch together, as if realizing he couldn't picture himself introducing her to his friends. Each failed attempt chipped away at her hope, and she gradually stopped trying. Life went on in its steady, solitary rhythm. Sam would rise before dawn, tend to the animals, check the fences, and spend the afternoons in the fields or repairing equipment. Her hands were always busy, but her mind often wandered, imagining what it might be like to have someone who saw her not as a curiosity or an oddity, but as a woman worth knowing, worth loving. She didn't expect fairy tale romance, she just wanted kindness, understanding, and someone who could meet her heart where it was. It was on an unusually warm spring morning when change arrived in Willow Creek, though Sam didn't recognize it at first. The town's annual cattle auction had rolled around, an event that drew ranchers, traders, and curious onlookers from miles away. Sam attended every year, partly out of necessity and partly for the rare chance to see fresh faces. She'd loaded her old truck with a few calves to sell and drove into town, the smell of hay and leather filling the cab. The auction yard was buzzing with life. Dust rose from the ground as boots shuffled and cattle lowed in the pens. The air carried the mingled sense of barbecue smoke from food stalls and the sharp tang of manure. Sam unloaded her calves, exchanged polite greetings with a few locals, and made her way toward the auction ring. She was scanning the crowd when she noticed someone unfamiliar, a man leaning casually against the fence, watching the proceedings with a relaxed ease. He was tall, and not quite as tall as her, but close enough that she didn't have to crane her neck to meet his eyes. His sun-weathered skin hinted at years of outdoor work, and his hat was tipped low, shadowing eyes that still seemed to sparkle. He had the kind of presence that was quietly confident, not boastful, and when he smiled at someone passing by, it was the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Sam didn't think much of it at first. New faces came and went at the auction, and she was used to strangers keeping their distance once they realized how tall she was. But then the man straightened, glanced her way, and instead of looking surprised or uneasy, he tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, you sure handle those horses better than I've ever seen." The words caught her off guard. She'd been leading a restless mare to the pen, and without realizing it, she calmed the animal with steady hands and a low, soothing voice. Most people just watched in silence, but this man had not only noticed it, he'd admired it. Sam felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she kept her tone even. "Thank you. Been working with horses all my life." "Shows," he replied simply, his gaze steady but warm. "Name's Ethan Carter. Just moved down from Oklahoma. Figured I'd see what Texas auctions are all about." They exchanged a few more words of small talk about the weather, the quality of the cattle that year, but something about the conversation lingered with Sam long after he'd moved on. He hadn't looked at her like she was strange. He hadn't hesitated before speaking, hadn't shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. If anything, he seemed genuinely interested. The rest of the day passed in its usual busy blur, but every now and then, Sam's eyes would drift across the crowd, searching for that familiar hat. Once, she caught him watching her again, not in the way people sometimes stare at a curious, assessing but in a way that felt a broken bar attentive. Like he saw something beyond her height, beyond the surface. That night, back on her porch, Sam found herself thinking about Ethan Carter. She told herself it was nothing, just a friendly stranger passing through. Still, she couldn't quite shake the memory of the way his voice had sounded when he said, "Ma'am, you sure handle those horses better than I've ever seen." She didn't know it yet, but that one simple sentence was the first crack in the walls she had built around her heart. Over the days following the cattle auction, Sam found herself thinking about Ethan Carter more than she cared to admit. She told herself it was because he was new in town, a fresh face in a place where everyone had known everyone for decades. But deep down, she knew it was the way he had looked at her, steady, unflinching, without the faintest trace of discomfort. Most men glanced up at her height and quickly looked away. Ethan's gaze had stayed, warm and direct. It wasn't long before she saw him again. A week later, she was loading bags of feed into her truck outside the general store when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Need a hand with that, ma'am?" She turned to see him standing there, hat tipped back, that same easy smile on his face. Sam, more out of habit than pride, shook her head. "I've got it." But Ethan didn't take the hint and walk away. Instead, he leaned against the side of the truck, watching her with a faint smirk. "I believe you," he said, "but sometimes it's nicer to let someone help, even when you don't need it." She paused, one hand gripping the handle of the feed sack, and for the briefest moment, she considered letting him lift it. Then, surprising even herself, she said, "All right. You can hand me the next one." Ethan didn't make a show of it. He just grabbed the bag, set it gently in the bed of the truck, and tossed it off his hands. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the upcoming rodeo, but there was something unspoken in the air, a sense of ease that Sam rarely felt around strangers. After that, Ethan seemed to cross her path more often. Sometimes it was at the diner, where he'd be sitting at the counter nursing a coffee when she came in for lunch. Other times, it was at the feed store or on the road, his old Ford truck passing hers with a wave. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but after the third or fourth time, she began to suspect that Ethan was making a point to see her. One afternoon, she caught him standing by the fence at the edge of her property. She had been repairing a loose board when she noticed him leaning casually against a fence post, watching her work. "You know," she called out, "most folks knock before they come onto someone's ranch." Ethan grinned. "Figured if I knocked, you'd tell me you were too busy to talk. This way, you might let me stay a while." She rolled her eyes but felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "Well, since you're here, you can hold this board steady." He stepped forward without hesitation, taking hold of the wood as she hammered it into place. When they finished, she offered him a glass of iced tea on the porch. They sat for nearly an hour, talking about everything from cattle breeds to Oklahoma storms. Sam found herself laughing a real, unguarded laugh she hadn't felt in years. It was in those small moments that Ethan began to see the parts of her no one else noticed. He saw the way she paused to check on the old mare with the stiff leg, stroking her muzzle gently before moving on. He saw her leave out extra feed for a stray dog that had been lurking near the barn. He noticed how she carried water up to Mrs. Greer's porch without being asked, just because the old woman lived alone and the summer heat had been brutal. One evening, Ethan stopped by under the pretense of asking for help with a stubborn colt. Sam saddled Daisy and followed him to his place, where she spent an hour showing him how to calm the skittish animal. When they were done, the sun was dipping low, staining the sky with streaks of orange and pink. They stood by the fence, watching the colt graze, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You know," Ethan said finally, "I've met a lot of folks who can work a ranch. But I've never met someone who does it with as much heart as you do." Sam felt her cheeks warm, though she tried to play it off. "It's just the way I was raised." Ethan shook his head. "No, it's not just that. You care. You notice things other people don't. That's rare." It was then that Sam realized she had been waiting for some union, not just anyone, but someone like him. Someone who saw past the calloused hands and the broad shoulders, who didn't treat her strength like a challenge or an oddity. Someone who noticed the way she poured herself into everything she did, quietly and without fanfare. Still, part of her hesitated. Life had taught her that people could be kind for a while, but kindness often faded once the novelty wore off. She told herself not to read too much into his words, to keep her heart in check. But Ethan wasn't like the others. He didn't disappear after a week or two. He kept showing up, sometimes with a reason, sometimes just to sit on her porch and share the quiet. One night, after helping her mend a section of fence that had been knocked down in a storm, Ethan lingered. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the crickets were singing in the grass. Sam handed him a glass of sweet tea, and they sat side by side on the porch swing. For a while, they talked about nothing of the weather, the rodeo, a funny story about his neighbor's goat. Then, as the conversation faded, Ethan turned toward her. "Sam," he said softly, "I didn't come to Willow Creek just for the cattle auction. And I didn't keep stopping by because I needed help with ranch work." She looked at him, her heart beating just a little faster. "Then why?" "Because," he said, holding her gaze, "you've got the kindest heart I've ever known. You're strong, sure, but that's not what I see first. What I see is someone who gives without expecting anything back. Someone who's steady and real. And if you'll have me, I'd be proud to be the man beside you." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch swing and the distant chirp of night insects. Sam felt a lump in her throat, the kind that comes when you're caught between disbelief and joy. She had spent so long thinking that no one could see her beyond her height, her strength, her ranch work. But here was a man who had been watching all along, and what he saw was her heart. She didn't say yes right then. Instead, she smiled a soft, genuine smile and reached over to take his hand. It was a small gesture, but for Sam, it was the beginning of something she had once thought impossible. Over the weeks that followed, their bond grew, not through grand declarations, but through the steady rhythm of shared work, shared meals, and shared silences. Ethan became a fixture in their life, and soon, in the eyes of the town, they were no longer the giant cowgirl and the newcomer from Oklahoma. They were simply Sam and Ethan, the couple who looked happiest when they were together. The whispers in Willow Creek changed. People still talk as small towns always do, but now the tone was different. They spoke of how Ethan and Sam were a perfect match, how you could see the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world, how she laughed more than she used to. And Sam, for her part, stopped caring about what anyone thought. She had found someone who saw her heart before her height, her kindness before her strength. And that, she realized, was worth more than anything.